Moving into the old Victorian house on the outskirts of town was meant to be nothing more than a scientific endeavor, a chance for me to debunk the irrational tales of ghosts and hauntings that had plagued the place for generations. As a seasoned scientist with a firm grip on reality, I scoffed at the notion of the supernatural. I was confident that my rational explanations would lay the foundation for a best-selling book that would debunk the age-old myths. The first night in the house was quiet, almost disappointingly so. The walls creaked, the floors groaned, but nothing that couldn't be attributed to the natural settling of an aging structure. I chuckled to myself, imagining how easily these mundane sounds could be mistaken for ghostly apparitions. I was ready to wrap up my investigation and return to the comforts of my own home. But the following nights were far from mundane. I awoke to the sound of whispering, faint voices that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. My heart raced as I followed the sound, my skepticism wavering for the first time. The voices grew louder as I approached the old attic, its door slightly ajar. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead as I pushed the door open and stepped inside. What I saw defied all reason. An ethereal figure, a shimmering silhouette, stood before me. It was there for just an instant, then vanished as if it were never there. My breath caught in my throat, my scientific mind struggling to comprehend the inexplicable. Perhaps it was a trick of the light, a figment of my imagination? But the chill that clung to the air, the heaviness that settled in the room, defied rationalization. Determined to find answers, I set up an array of sensors and cameras throughout the house. The results were confounding: temperature drops, unexplained movements, strange fluctuations in electromagnetic fields. These were not the results I had expected. Yet, my training and years of rationality told me there must be an explanation. As the nights wore on, the phenomena grew more intense. Objects moved on their own, shadowy figures danced at the edge of my vision, and chilling whispers echoed in the corridors. I analyzed the data meticulously, attempting to attribute the occurrences to natural causes, drafts, faulty wiring, my own fatigue-induced hallucinations. But deep down, doubt began to creep in. One night, I decided to take a stroll through the house, relying on my flashlight to guide me. I noticed something unusual, an irregular pattern of muddy footprints leading toward the basement. I dismissed it as a possible intrusion by someone. I checked the cameras in the basement, which were mysteriously non-functional. Nervously, I descended into the basement, my flashlight flickering as I reached the bottom of the stairs. What I found sent shivers down my spine, a series of demonic symbols carved into the ground, etched with malevolent precision. Before I could fully process the implications, a shadow with crimson eyes emerged from the darkness. Panic surged through me as my flashlight abruptly died, plunging me into complete darkness. Heart pounding, I scrambled back up the stairs, but the cellar door had sealed itself shut. I pushed and pulled, but it wouldn't open, as if it were mocking my attempts to escape. Fear closed in around me. I was trapped, cut off from the world above, alone in a realm where the supernatural defied the rational. My skepticism was shattered, replaced by a stark and chilling reality that I could no longer deny. In a moment of desperation, I recalled seeing a hammer under the stairs during my previous explorations. Stumbling in the dark, I managed to feel the hammer. I swung at the old cellar door with all my might. The wood splintered, the sound echoing through the darkness. Adrenaline surged as I hit it again and again, until finally, the door gave way. Without looking back, I sprinted out of the house, my heart racing as I gasped for air. I didn't stop until I was far away from the menacing old house that had become a labyrinth of terror. The next morning, with trembling hands and a deep sense of unease, I returned to the house to gather my belongings. The weight of the experience still hung heavy in the air, a reminder that even the staunchest skepticism could crumble in the face of the unknown. With trembling hands, I consulted the local archives, tracing the history of the house back to its origins. What I uncovered was a tale of tragedy, of lives lost and spirits trapped in a liminal space. I read accounts of seances and rituals, of summonings and forbidden knowledge. The rational explanations I had sought were being replaced by a truth I could not deny: the supernatural was real. The moment we laid eyes on the historic mansion, with its towering turrets and ornate Victorian architecture, we knew we had found our dream home. The realtor regaled us with tales of the house's illustrious past, its former grandeur, and its remarkable history. It was to be our passion project, a restoration that would bring this forgotten beauty back to life. As we embarked on the renovations, our excitement was palpable. We eagerly rolled up our sleeves, ready to uncover the hidden gems beneath layers of dust and decay. The process was slow, painstaking, but as the weeks turned into months, we began to unearth more than just the house's architectural history. Strange anomalies became evident: walled-off sections that defied logical design, doorways leading to nowhere, and odd sounds that seemed to echo through the walls. One evening, while peeling back a particularly stubborn section of wallpaper, I revealed a concealed doorway, its edges time-worn. It was as if the house itself was guiding us to these hidden spaces. A sense of unease settled over me as I ventured beyond the threshold, my flashlight casting eerie shadows in the dim light. The hidden room was small and suffused with an inexplicable chill, even though the temperature outside was warm. Antique furniture lay abandoned, layers of dust covering once opulent fabrics. A portrait on the wall caught my attention, a stern-faced couple, their eyes seemingly following my every move. The unsettling feeling that we were being watched crept over me, and I hurriedly left the room, promising myself it was just my imagination playing tricks. As the renovations continued, more hidden rooms were uncovered, each one more unsettling than the last. In one, we discovered a collection of old journals and letters, revealing a twisted tale of jealousy, betrayal, and tragedy. The former owners' lives had been marred by darkness, a tale of obsession that seemed to seep into the very walls of the house. One day, while my wife had gone to the local shop for some supplies, I found myself alone in the mansion. I was lost in thought, contemplating the history that seeped into every corner of the house, when I heard it, the faint sound of laughter. At first, I dismissed it as my imagination, a product of the house's history playing tricks on my mind. But the laughter persisted, growing louder and more distinct. My curiosity got the best of me, and I followed the sound through the hallways, my heart quickening with each step. The laughter led me to the room with the stern-faced couple's portrait. The air in the room felt heavy, charged with an energy I couldn't quite explain. As I looked around, a sense of unease washed over me. Suddenly objects on the tables and shelves began to shake and rattle, as if moved by an invisible force. My rational mind struggled to understand what was happening. There had to be a logical explanation, a scientific reason behind it all. But then, without warning, a vase crashed to the floor, shattering into 1,000 pieces. The room seemed to close in around me, the air thick with tension. I didn't waste a moment. I fled from the room, my heart racing, and slammed the door behind me. After that incident, the activity inside the house escalated. Shadows moved of their own accord, whispering voices echoed through the corridors, and the air grew colder even in the midst of summer. My wife and I began to sleep fitfully, waking up to strange noises in the middle of the night, our dreams haunted by unsettling visions. One fateful evening, as we ventured into a newly discovered underground passage, we stumbled upon an eerie altar adorned with cryptic symbols and faded photographs. It was then that the truth became clear: the former owners had dabbled in the occult, their quest for power leading them down a path of darkness. And now, their restless spirits sought to consume us. As we raced to leave the passage, the air grew thick with an otherworldly energy. A blood-chilling shriek echoed through the corridor, and a shadowy figure with hollow eyes materialized before us. Panic surged as we ran, the walls closing in around us, and the passage seemed to stretch on endlessly. Just when all hope seemed lost, we burst into the open air. As we caught our breath, a chilling breeze swept through the open entrance of the passage. My eyes widened in terror as I saw a spectral, ethereal hand emerge from the darkness, its fingers stretching outwards. It was as if the malevolent entity was reaching out, grasping for anything it could get hold of. With adrenaline coursing through my veins, I yanked my wife away just in time. We stumbled out of that cursed mansion, our breaths ragged, our hearts racing in terror. The darkness of the night surrounded us, but it was a welcome sight compared to the horrors we had witnessed within those haunted walls. We ran until our legs could carry us no more, until the mansion was nothing more than a sinister silhouette in the distance. We never returned to that mansion. It remained a grim reminder of the darkness that could fester within the most beautiful facades. Our dreams of restoration had turned into a nightmare of survival, and we were determined to move on, to put the horrors behind us.
Returning to my childhood home was never something I had anticipated. The house, perched on a quiet street, held memories both sweet and bitter. But now, with my mother ailing and in need of care, I found myself once again crossing the threshold of that old house, hoping to provide some comfort in her twilight years. The years had not been kind to the house. Its once vibrant paint had faded, and the garden, which my mother had lovingly tended to, now lay overgrown and neglected. My heart ached as I stepped through the front door, the echoes of my childhood laughter still haunting the air. The first few days were uneventful, filled with the mundane tasks of caregiving. I cleaned, cooked, and listened to my mother's stories of days gone by. But as the nights settled in, so did a strange sense of unease. One evening, as I sat in the dimly lit living room, I saw a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned to find a young girl, no older than 10, standing in the doorway. She wore a dress from another era, her eyes wide with a mixture of curiosity and fear. My heart pounded as I blinked, convinced that I had imagined her. But the girl remained, her presence undeniable. She moved with a ghostly grace, her form translucent. I hesitated, my rational mind rejecting the idea that I was witnessing a ghost. It had to be a trick of the light, a product of my own exhaustion. The visions became more real with each passing night. The old house seemed to be transforming, its walls becoming permeable between the past and present. The apparitions that had once appeared distant and ephemeral grew stronger, more corporeal, and more terrifying. One night, as the moonlight filtered through the windows, I heard a series of unsettling knocks echoing through the corridors. My heart raced as I followed the sound, my steps hesitant but driven by a morbid curiosity. The knocking led me to the corridor, where the apparition of my mother stood. But she was not the woman I had known, her face contorted in anguish, her eyes filled with a vacant desperation. My breath caught in my throat as I watched her hit her head against the wall, over and over again. The sound was sickening, the thuds resonating with a bone-chilling intensity. I stumbled back, unable to tear my eyes away from the horrifying spectacle. And then, in a grotesque twist, her head turned 180 degrees, her eyes locking onto mine. Frozen in terror, I felt a primal urge to flee, to escape the nightmare that was unfolding before me. Without hesitation, I turned and sprinted back to my room, slamming the door shut and locking it behind me. My heart pounded like a drum, sweat trickling down my forehead as I struggled to comprehend what I had just witnessed. Inside the safety of my room, I began to question my own sanity. The lines between reality and nightmare were blurring, and the past seemed to seep into the present with an eerie, malevolent force. I realized that the house itself was somehow feeding off the negative emotions that had taken root within its walls. My mother began to act strangely during the day, her demeanor shifting between moments of lucidity and confusion. She would gaze into the distance, her eyes filled with a haunted expression, as if she were reliving memories long buried. It was as though the house's unsettling atmosphere was affecting her, tugging at the threads of her own past. One afternoon, as I sat by her bedside, my mother's hand clenched mine with an unexpected strength. Her eyes, clouded with a mixture of fear and recognition, met mine. She began to speak in hushed, trembling tones, her voice a mere whisper. "I see them," she murmured, her voice quivering. "The shadows of the past, they walk these halls." My heart ached as I listened to her words. I could see the weight of her memories pressing down on her, her face etched with a mixture of sorrow and apprehension. I held her hand tighter, trying to offer whatever comfort I could. The days turned into weeks, and the house seemed to grow darker, its atmosphere more oppressive. I ventured into the attic, hoping to uncover any clues that might shed light on the history that had become so intertwined with the house's present. Among the dusty boxes and forgotten relics, I stumbled upon a collection of old letters and photographs, each piece a fragment of a story that had remained hidden for years. As I read through the letters, the pieces began to fall into place. The young girl I had seen in the doorway was not a mere apparition, she had been real, a friend from my mother's childhood. The photographs showed them playing together in the very rooms I now walked through. But the letters spoke of a tragedy, of an accident that had taken the young girl's life at the hands of my mother's negligence. Now, when her mother was weak and sick, the tormented spirit of the young girl who had once been her friend had returned for revenge. The weight of the past and the guilt that my mother carried seemed to have summoned this vengeful entity, a manifestation of the tragedy that had unfolded within these walls. Each night, the haunting grew more intense. The air in the house grew colder, and the atmosphere grew thick with an otherworldly presence. I could feel it, the anger, the pain, the thirst for retribution emanating from the shadows that danced along the walls. My mother's health deteriorated further, her frail form barely recognizable from the vibrant woman she had once been. I knew that the entity was tormenting her, reliving the trauma it had suffered and projecting it onto my mother. Desperation clawed at me. I couldn't bear to see my mother suffer like this, to be trapped in a cycle of guilt and fear that wasn't entirely her own. I knew I had to confront the spirit, to find a way to appease its anger and set both my mother and the girl's restless soul free. Research led me to a local historian who was familiar with the history of the house. The historian explained that the girl had fallen from a balcony due to a series of unfortunate events, her death a result of a tragic accident rather than my mother's negligence. But the guilt had consumed my mother, and that guilt had fueled the spirit's torment. Armed with this new understanding, I returned to the house, determined to face the spirit head-on. The atmosphere was suffocating, the energy thick with anger. I ventured into the corridor where my mother had once been tormented by the entity, and there it stood, the young girl, her form distorted with rage and grief. "I know the truth," I said, my voice steady but tinged with compassion. "I know what happened wasn't my mother's fault. She has suffered enough, and you have suffered enough. It's time to find peace." The girl's eyes bore into mine, her anger momentarily warring with a flicker of sadness. I held my ground, pouring all the empathy and understanding I could muster into my gaze. Slowly, the girl's form began to waver, the air around her shimmering. And then, with a heart-wrenching scream that echoed through the house, the spirit began to dissipate. The energy that had once radiated anger and vengeance grew faint, replaced by a sense of release and freedom. The weight that had held the house captive began to lift, the atmosphere growing lighter with every passing moment. In the days that followed, the house seemed to come back to life. The garden flourished, and the once faded paint regained its vibrancy. My mother's health improved, her demeanor changing from one of fear to one of acceptance. It was as if the house had finally found its peace, and in doing so, had granted my mother the same. As we prepared to leave, I looked back at the old house one last time. It was no longer a vessel of torment but a place that had witnessed both joy and sorrow. The past was no longer a prison, it had become a path to understanding and healing. My mother and I walked away, hand in hand, ready to embrace the future with newfound strength.